My wife's car wasn't in the driveway when I came home early, but her wedding ring was sitting on the kitchen counter next to a half-empty glass of wine. What I found over the next 72 hours wasn't just a betrayal. It was a lie buried so deep it had roots in a life I'd forgotten I'd lived. I invited my wife's lover's wife to our firm's anniversary gala, and what happened that night didn't just end two marriages. It dismantled an empire built on stolen money and hollow promises. But the real twist, the one that still keeps me up at night for reasons I never expected, was the daughter I never knew I had, and she would become the only person in that room I was truly fighting for. My name is Thomas Kellerman. I'm 54 years old, and until about 8 months ago, I was the kind of man other men pointed to at Chamber of Commerce dinners and said, "There goes a guy who built something real." I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the son of a plumber who worked 6 days a week and never complained once. I watched my father come home with cracked hands and an honest face every evening of my childhood, and I swore I'd carry that same integrity into whatever I built. I just planned to build it bigger. I spent my 20s grinding through commercial construction, learning the trade from the ground up, taking on small contracts nobody else wanted, delivering them on time and under budget until the bigger clients started calling. By 40, Kellerman Construction had grown into one of the most respected mid-sized firms in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Hospitals, university buildings, mixed-use developments. We weren't the biggest, but we were the most trusted. That reputation meant everything to me. My wife and I had been married for 16 years. We met at a charity golf tournament when she was working in corporate event planning, and I was trying to convince a potential client that I was the right man for a $20 million healthcare campus. She walked up, handed me a water bottle, and said, "You look like you're about to close something important." I was. Her. We were married 14 months later at a vineyard outside Austin. For most of those 16 years, I believed we had the kind of partnership that people wrote speeches about. She built her event coordination business into a genuine operation. I kept growing Kellerman Construction. We raised 2 dogs, renovated a beautiful home in Southlake, and talked about the future the way people do when they genuinely believe it belongs to them. The first sign was small enough to dismiss. Last spring, my wife started taking her phone into rooms she'd never taken it before. The bathroom, the backyard, our walk-in closet. I told myself she was managing a difficult client. She had difficult clients all the time. Then came the weekends where she had site walkthroughs for corporate events that I'd never heard mentioned before. Then the new perfume she started wearing that she said she'd bought online but couldn't remember the website. Each individual thing was explainable. Stacked together, they formed a silhouette I didn't want to recognize. The night everything cracked open, I was supposed to be in Austin for a 2-day bid review. We wrapped up early on day 1, and I drove back that same evening, thinking I'd surprise her with takeout from her favorite Thai place on Greenville Avenue. When I pulled into our neighborhood, I saw an unfamiliar Mercedes parked 2 houses down from ours. I wouldn't have thought anything of it except that I recognized the custom license plate. Mirrored envy. I'd seen that plate in the parking garage of my own office building a dozen times. It belonged to my business partner, Derek. Derek Ashworth had come on board with Kellerman Construction 7 years ago as a co-managing partner. He was everything I'd never been. Naturally polished, socially magnetic, the kind of man who could charm a city council into a favorable zoning decision over a single dinner. I'd always focused on the build. Derek focused on the room. It was a good division, or so I believed. I sat in my truck on the street for 4 minutes, not because I needed time to think. I needed time to not do something I couldn't undo. Then I drove to a hotel off the highway, checked in under my name, and made 2 phone calls before midnight. The first was to a private investigator named Carla Simmons, who came recommended by my attorney friend from my early contracting days. I'd referred business her way, and she'd told me once, "If you ever need the other kind of work, call me first." I called her first. The second call was to my personal accountant, Paul. I didn't tell him why, but I asked him to pull the last 18 months of Kellerman Construction's internal expense reconciliations and have them on my desk by Thursday morning. Paul asked no questions. That's why I kept him for 11 years. Carla had eyes on my wife and Derek within 48 hours. By the end of the week, I had photographs. Restaurant brews with hands intertwined. A hotel in Frisco. Weekend texts that Carla had legally obtained through metadata tracking. The timeline suggested this had been going on for at least 7 months. 7 looks up my business partner sitting across from me in our glass-walled conference room, shaking my hand after client dinners, clapping me on the shoulder at groundbreakings, while sleeping with my wife 2 or 3 times a week. The accounting review hit differently. Paul called me on a Tuesday morning with the kind of quiet in his voice that told me the news was worse than I'd asked for. There were procurement irregularities stretching back 4 years. Vendor invoices from shell companies routed through a subsidiary Derek had quietly established in Nevada, overbilling on 3 major municipal contracts, with the overages disappearing into accounts that bore no relationship to anything Kellerman Construction had authorized. Conservative estimate, somewhere between $3.4 and $4.1 million skimmed from a company I'd built with my own hands. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of our office building and stared at Paul's email for a long time. The anger was there, cold and absolute, but underneath it was something that felt almost like grief. 7 years. I'd trusted this man with my company. My wife had trusted him into our home, and he'd been stealing from both of us simultaneously. One emotionally, one financially, and apparently found that perfectly manageable. That was when Carla called with the other piece of information. The one I hadn't asked for. She met me at a coffee shop in Addison on a Wednesday morning. She slid a folder across the table, the same way my old contractors used to slide punch list documents at project closeouts. Matter of fact. Final. Thomas, she said. There's something in here that's not about Derek or your wife. But you need to see it. Inside the folder was a photograph of a young woman. 22 years old, according to the brief bio Carla had included. She was standing outside a veterinary clinic in Memphis, Tennessee, wearing scrubs and holding a large orange cat. She had dark eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw that I recognized immediately because I saw it every morning in the mirror. Her name was Lily. Her mother was a woman named Sarah, whom I had dated during my last year at Oklahoma State before I'd moved to Dallas to chase the construction work. Sarah and I had ended things amicably, or so I'd believed. She'd gone back to Memphis to be near her family. I'd thrown myself into work and never looked back. I hadn't known Sarah was pregnant. According to Carla, Sarah had written me a letter when Lily was 18 months old, sent to a forwarding address that had long since gone cold. She tried once and then decided, correctly, as circumstances had it, that a man who didn't respond wasn't worth chasing. I looked at this young woman's photograph for a long time. Lily. She was finishing her first year at a veterinary school in Tennessee, working part-time at a clinic, supporting herself almost entirely. Sarah had remarried when Lily was 6 to a decent man who had been present and reliable. But Lily had started asking questions about her biological father in the last 2 years. She'd found my name. She'd looked me up. She hadn't reached out yet. Carla said, quietly, "The ball's in your court on that one." I drove back toward the office in a daze. I had a business partner who'd stolen $4 million from me. I had a wife who'd been sleeping with that same business partner for the better part of a year. And I had a daughter I never met who was studying to be a veterinarian in Tennessee and had my jaw and apparently my stubbornness. For the first time since I'd found Derek's car on my street, the anger stepped back and something else took its place, something that felt uncomfortably close to purpose. I contacted Lily through an email Carla helped me draft. I kept it short. I told her I'd recently learned about her existence. I told her I understood as she had no interest in contact. I told her that if she did want to talk, I would make myself available at whatever pace she needed. I hit send and then sat in the parking garage of my own building for 20 minutes wondering what kind of man sends an email like that to a daughter he's never met. She responded in 3 days. 2 sentences. "I've been wondering if you'd ever reach out. I have questions." We talked on the phone for the first time on a Thursday evening when my wife thought I was at a job site walk. Lily's voice was careful and direct. She asked me to explain my side of the story without any softening. I did. She asked whether I'd known. I told her the honest truth, I hadn't. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "My mom said you were driven." She meant it as a warning. "I understand why," I said. We talked for 2 hours. She asked about the construction business, about Texas, about what kind of person I was when I wasn't building things. I asked about veterinary school, about the orange cat in the photograph, about what Memphis was like in summer. We were 2 strangers trying to find the edges of something neither of us had a template for. By the end of the call, she said she'd be willing to meet in person when she had a break from clinicals. I told her I'd fly to Memphis any time she said the word. She said, "Let me think about it." I said, "Take all the time you need." Over the next 3 weeks, I maintained my normal routine. Morning workouts, site visits, meetings with Derek where I sat across the conference table and watched him lie to my face with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. I was building something, the same way I'd always built things, methodically, from the foundation up, with every detail in place before anyone saw the surface. My attorney Marcus had been drafting both sets of legal documents simultaneously. Divorce papers for my wife, and a civil fraud complaint against Derek Ashworth, which we'd coordinated with a forensic accounting firm and, at the appropriate moment, would be handed directly to the district attorney's office along with Paul's reconciliations and 3 independent audits. The federal wire fraud angle, because Derek had used interstate transfers to move the embezzled funds, meant that the FBI's Financial Crimes Division was also paying close attention. I reached out to Derek's wife, Pamela, the same way I'd reached out to Lily. Carefully. Deliberately. Carefully. Deliberately. I'd met Pamela at firm events and charity functions over the years. She was a high school art teacher with a quiet dignity that had always struck me as slightly incongruous with her husband's relentless self-promotion. She didn't deserve what was coming, but she deserved the truth more than she deserved to be blindsided by it in front of strangers. We met for coffee at a place in Grapevine on a Saturday morning when Derek was at what he told her was a client golf outing. I told her everything, the affair first, because that was the wound she could understand immediately. Then the financial fraud, because that was the wound that would affect her legally and materially in ways she needed time to prepare for. She didn't cry right away. She looked out the window at the parking lot for a long moment and then looked back at me with the expression of someone who'd suspected something for a long time and was now having the suspicion confirmed. "How long?" she asked. "7 months on the affair. 4 years on the money," I said. "I'm sorry, Pamela." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and was quiet for a while. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I told her about the Kellerman Construction Anniversary Gala, a formal dinner we held every 5 years for clients, civic leaders, and long-term partners. 300 people. The next one was in 6 weeks. Derek had helped plan it. My wife had been hired as the event coordinator. The irony of that particular detail had not escaped me. I told Pamela what I intended to do. I told her she didn't have to be part of it. She could take the information I'd given her, retain her own attorney, and handle things entirely separately. She had every option. She took a sip of her coffee and said, "No. I want to be there." Lily flew in from Memphis 4 days before the gala. I picked her up at DFW in my truck, and for a moment, when she came through the arrival's doors, and I saw her face in person for the first time, I had to grip the steering wheel of the cart I'd brought to carry her bag, because my hands needed something to hold on to. She was taller than I'd expected. She had her mother's way of looking directly at you, without any of the social softening most people apply by default. She looked at me for a second and then said, "You have the same years as me. That's unsettling." I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in 2 months. We spent 4 days talking. I took her to a job site outside Fort Worth and walked her through the way a building comes together, the sequence of systems, the way everything depends on the integrity of what came before. She told me about the complexity of large animal surgery, about how much she loved the diagnostic puzzle of figuring out what was wrong with a creature that couldn't tell you directly. We were more similar than either of us had anticipated, which I suspected was simultaneously comforting and annoying for her. On the second evening, we sat on my back deck with iced tea, and she asked me directly about the gala and what I was planning. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at her glass for a moment. "You're not doing this just for you," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "Who was it for?" I thought about it honestly. For Paul, who'd worked loyally for 11 years. For the subcontractors whose bids had been manipulated without their knowledge. For Pamela, who deserved not to be lied to for another single day. For the city of Dallas, which had overpaid for 3 public buildings. And for myself. I admit it, because I built that company, and he stole from it, and I want him to know that I know. Lily nodded slowly. "And my wife?" I looked at her. "She doesn't deserve a platform. What she did was a betrayal. What Derek did was a crime. Those are different scales." Lily said, "Does she know about me?" "No," I said. "Nobody does. Except Pamela." "Good," she said. "Keep it that way until you're ready." She paused. "And you're going to handle Pamela correctly?" "I will," I said. She looked at me for a long time with that direct, unfiltered assessment she'd inherited from somewhere. Then she said, "Okay, I'll be there." The Kellerman Construction 25th Anniversary Gala was held at a hotel ballroom in downtown Dallas on a Friday evening in October. 300 chairs, 4-course dinner, a 12-piece band, and enough accumulated professional trust in that room to have built half the skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My wife had coordinated every detail of the evening, the floral arrangements, the table assignments, the lighting design. She poured weeks into it, completely unaware that she was helping me set the stage for the last night of the version of our life she'd constructed. I arrived with Pamela Ashworth on my arm. The effect was immediate and visible. By the time we crossed the lobby, 3 different people had clocked us together and whispered to whoever was beside them. When we entered the ballroom, I watched the reaction travel across my wife's face like a weather system moving in from the west. Confusion first, then a rapid, private calculation. Then a smile so controlled it had to cost her something. "Pamela," she said, coming toward us with her arms slightly extended. "What a surprise. I didn't see you on the RSVP list." "I invited her," I said pleasantly. "Since Derek's been so consumed with work lately, I thought she might enjoy an evening out." Pamela smiled with the warmth of a woman who had had 4 days to prepare for this exact moment. "You look beautiful," she told my wife. "That color is perfect on you." Derek found us 12 minutes later. I watched him process the tableau. His wife on my arm, my wife standing beside us with a champagne flute gripped a little too firmly. And for just a fraction of a second, the performance slipped. The confident business partner expression flickered out and something rawer and more frightened moved across his face before he pulled the mask back on. "Thomas," he said, extending his hand. "I didn't know Pamela was coming." "Last-minute addition," I said, shaking it firmly. "We've been seated together tonight. All of us." We moved to the table. Lily was already there, composed and poised in a dark green dress that made her look exactly like someone who belonged in a room full of successful Dallas professionals. She stood when I approached. "Dad," she said, embracing me with the natural ease of someone who had decided to commit to the performance. And I believed, something genuine underneath it. "You look great." The table went very still. My wife looked at Lily, then at me, then back at Lily. Lily turned and offered her hand across the table. "I'm Lily, Thomas's daughter. It's so nice to finally meet you. He's told me a great deal about his work." The dinner proceeded in the way that only deeply uncomfortable formal dinners can, with excruciating surface-level politeness and enough subterranean tension to power a turbine. Derek barely ate. My wife kept touching her necklace in a repetitive gesture I recognized as her tell for anxiety. Pamela was extraordinary. Composed, gracious, asking Derek questions about his schedule with the precise pleasantness of someone who had already retained an attorney and filed the initial paperwork. When the dinner plates were cleared and the band shifted into background music, I stood and picked up my champagne glass. The room quieted, as it always did when the founder of a company stood at a gala celebrating 25 years of that company's existence. 25 years ago, I said, I poured the foundation for a building in a strip of Tulsa dirt, and I believed then what I still believe now. That everything worth building starts with what's underneath, the part nobody sees. The integrity of the foundation determines everything that rises above it. If the foundation is compromised, it doesn't matter how beautiful the building looks from the outside. It will eventually come down. I picked up a small remote from beside my plate and connected it to the presentation system that Kellerman Construction had used for client pitches in this same room for over a decade. The first slide that appeared on the screen was not a photograph. It was a financial document, a spreadsheet of vendor payments routed through a shell company called Ashworth Meridian Ventures, LLC, registered in Nevada, operated exclusively by my business partner, funded entirely by Kellerman Construction. I said 4 years ago, someone I trusted began quietly stealing from this company, from the clients in this room who paid for buildings in good faith, from the subcontractors who submitted honest bids, from 22 employees who come to work every day and do their jobs with integrity. Tonight, I want everyone who was affected to know what happened and who did it. The next several slides laid out the full scope. Invoices, wire transfers, project overruns mapped against internal communications. Derek's name appeared 47 times across the documentation. I had edited nothing and softened nothing. Derek tried to stand. He managed to get halfway out of his chair before 2 men in dark suits, who were not hotel security, appeared at the edge of the room. One of them placed a hand on his shoulder. The hand was unhurried and absolute. Those men were from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The DA's office had made the arrest coordination decision 2 weeks earlier. We had simply given them the time and the place. My wife had not moved. She sat with both hands flat on the tablecloth, looking at me with an expression that had passed through shock and arrived somewhere closer to reckoning. Pamela stood then. She did not need to raise her voice. The room was already silent. "I'll be filing for divorce Monday morning," she said clearly, "and I've been in contact with 3 of the investors named in these documents who will be pursuing full civil recovery." She looked at Derek. "You have taken enough from enough people." Then she sat back down and picked up her champagne glass with the quiet authority of a woman who had closed the loop on something she should have had the courage to close years earlier. Derek was escorted out of the ballroom. I watched him go and felt not the rush of satisfaction I'd expected, but something quieter. The particular relief that comes when something that has been broken and ignored for too long is finally acknowledged. I turned to my wife. The room was watching. I didn't need them to, I said, not loudly. "The divorce papers are at our attorney's office. You'll receive your copies tomorrow. The house is yours to stay in until we reach an agreement. I've already made arrangements to stay elsewhere." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Thomas, I know." I said, "I am too." I believed we both meant it. 6 months later, I stood in the parking lot of an animal clinic in Memphis on a Tuesday morning in April, leaning against my truck, watching a surgical resident explain something to a client with complete confidence and obvious competence. The resident was Lily. The orange cat from the photograph was somewhere inside the building, apparently a permanent resident that the clinic had adopted as a kind of mascot. His name, Lily had informed me, was Plaintiff. Sarah had agreed to meet for lunch that afternoon. We hadn't spoken since Oklahoma State, and the phone call we'd had to arrange the lunch had been careful and a little awkward, and also, somehow, necessary. She deserved a conversation. She'd raised an extraordinary person largely on her own, had done it without bitterness, and had eventually told Lily the truth when Lily was old enough to ask for it. I owed her more than I could fully repay, but a conversation was a start. I had transferred a substantial amount into an education trust for Lily, not as a transaction, but as an acknowledgement of 22 years of financial absence that her mother had covered entirely. Lily had argued with me about it for 20 minutes on the phone. I pointed out that arguing about it was proof she'd inherited the stubbornness, and she'd eventually laughed and accepted. Derek was waiting trial. His attorney had already begun the process of plea negotiations. The financial recovery for defrauded clients was expected to cover approximately 60 cents on the dollar, which was better than most of them had anticipated. Pamela had moved to a smaller home in Plano, and by all accounts was teaching art to high schoolers who adored her, which struck me as exactly right. My wife and I had reached a divorce settlement that was fair by any objective measure. She had relocated to Nashville and was, from what I understood, rebuilding her event coordination business there. I wished her well in the way that you wish someone well, when you have both caused and received damage and decided the only honest thing left to do is move forward. Kellerman Construction had survived. It had cost me 2 months of difficult conversations with clients, a transparency report published on our website detailing exactly what had happened and what we'd done about it, and a public commitment to independent auditing going forward. Several clients had called personally to say they respected how we'd handled it. One said it was the most honest thing he'd seen a company do in 30 years of real estate development. I put that in the category of things that are both gratifying and sad in equal measure. Lily came out of the clinic at noon, still in her scrubs, carrying 2 paper bags from the sandwich place down the street. "You've been standing out here for an hour," she said. "I was watching you work." She handed me a sandwich. "You're going to be insufferable when I actually graduate, aren't you?" "Probably," I said. We sat on the tailgate of my truck and ate our sandwiches in the Memphis spring sunshine and talked about our cases and my current projects and what I thought about Nashville as a real estate market and whether she wanted to come to Dallas for Thanksgiving. We talked the way people talk when they are still figuring out the shape of something but are no longer afraid of what that shape might turn out to be. At one point, she looked sideways at me and said, "You know, when I first looked you up online, I thought you were going to be one of those guys who built a company and forgot he was a person." "I probably was," I said for a while. She nodded. "You're doing better." "High praise from a veterinarian," I told her. She smiled. "It's the highest I've got right now. Work with it." I said I would. The truth I've learned, at 54, after building 25 years of something real and watching part of it nearly come apart in a single season, is that what you build matters far less than whether it can stand up to the truth of what you are, the foundation I'd always talked about in my speeches. I'd been applying it to concrete and steel for decades without once applying it to myself. To the question of whether I'd been present to migration, whether the success I'd chased had cost me things I hadn't noticed losing until they were already gone. Michael's mother never got her closure in the story I'd heard. Jennifer, the woman who'd raised someone else's son alone for 20 years while the man responsible built his fortune and his reputation and his spotless public image. That story had bothered me for months before I understood why. It was because the absence of that reckoning was the absence of honesty, and without honesty, the revenge was just theater. So when Lily asked me to meet her mother, I didn't hesitate, and when Sarah walked into that Memphis lunch place and looked at me with the measured expression of a woman who had raised her daughter to be direct and careful and strong and was wondering if the man sitting across from her deserved any of it, I didn't make excuses. I didn't perform. I said exactly what was true. I didn't know. I should have looked harder. I'm sorry it took this long, and I'm going to spend whatever time she'll allow me doing better by the person you made. Sarah looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "She has your stubbornness." "I know," I said. "I consider it an asset." She smiled, just slightly. "You would." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It wasn't supposed to be. Some things don't resolve into a single clean emotion. They settle instead into something quieter and more durable. The kind of understanding that doesn't erase what came before but makes it possible to build something after. That's the part nobody tells you about revenge. Done right, it isn't the end of the story. It's just the demolition. The building comes later, and it's harder, and it takes longer, and it requires exactly the kind of patience and honesty and presence that you probably should have been applying all along. I'm working on it, one foundation at a time,